Well, amen. Well, we are going to continue in our sermon series through the Old Testament book of Job. And again, this is as a portion of what's called wisdom literature in the Bible. And so it's given to us so that we can walk with wisdom through various parts of life, but specifically helps us maintain our faith as we wrestle with suffering, pain, and grief in this life. Okay, so just as a review where we've been in this series already, Job, main character of the book, named after him. He is a righteous man. He's a man who loves the Lord. He follows the Lord, but he loses everything. He loses his children. He loses his wealth. He loses his physical health. And right after that, his wife comes to him and urges him to curse the Lord in response, but he refuses. He says, I'm not going to curse the Lord. And so chapters 2 through 31, a huge chunk of the book, gives us this discussion, or really a debate between Job and three of his friends. These three friends who say, you know what, we should go to our friend. We should comfort him. We should help him through his grieving. And so last week, I tried to give just a really quick overview of what Job's friends tell him as he's walking through this suffering. And basically, it's this over and over and over again for, 20-something chapters, which is why we condensed it down. Basically, they're just saying this over and over again. Job, only sinners suffer. You've suffered. Therefore, you're being punished for your sin. So, Job, if you want to get out of this season of suffering, you just need to repent. Repent of the sin you're being punished for and return to the Lord. Now, this is what's been called retribution theology. In other words, it's this belief that all of our suffering in life, all of it, is God punishing us for our sins. And on the flip side, all of our blessings are God rewarding us for our faithfulness. That's what these friends are believing, and it's shaping the way that they come and try to comfort Job. So again, here's Job, and all of this incredible time of pain and misery, and those he considers friends comes to him and says, Job, it's all your fault. You've brought this on yourself. Repent. And so part of Job's reply, we saw last week, is just to say to them, guys, you're miserable comforters. Like if your goal was to encourage me, you haven't. I mean, you've done just the opposite. You're not doing a good job here. And so last week, we just tried to wrestle with that and considered, what can Job's story teach us about this, again, horizontal aspect of our suffering, how we relate to one another as we each walk through times of suffering? How can we be better comforters with one another, something that we're actually called to as the body of Christ in the New Testament? So this morning, though, we're still going to focus on those same chapters, so still a very large chunk of the book today, but we're going to focus on Job's words. Okay, so we looked at the friends last week. Today, Job's words. How does he reply to his friends? What does he say? And most importantly, how does Job respond to God? And as we do that, we're also able to consider another really important aspect of suffering, and it's what effect can our faith have on our grief? And then vice versa, what effect can grief have on our faith? And this is really important because for the person who's in the middle of suffering, for the person walking through that season, both perspectives are simultaneous. Right? Both the horizontal and the vertical, right? We're trying to interact with those who want to comfort us. We're trying to interact with those who are grieving with us, and sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't do well. But we're also undoubtedly interacting with God in some way. And sometimes we do well, sometimes we don't do well. And so Job really does serve as this great example this morning as someone who has a faith in God. But the circumstances in his life really test his beliefs. It really shakes him a little. And I think that's something that all of us can relate to. So again, we've heard from Job's friends. Let's hear from Job. Now, again, we're going to be looking at a ton of verses this morning from a large range of chapters. Just follow along the best as you can. I'm just going to try and give you the highlights of Job's speeches and prayers. Before we do that, it's important to grasp in this story that it's not only Job's friends who hold to this retribution theology. Job actually does too. He actually agrees with them. And his experience, though, in life causes this crisis of faith. So I thought I believed this about God. Now some things are in question. Now it's making me come to a different conclusion. Okay, so three main points that Job's going to argue in this huge chunk. First thing Job wants to say in response to his friends and his circumstances is, number one, I don't deserve this because I'm innocent. He wants to make that very, very clear. He says, I don't deserve this because I'm innocent. Just a few examples. This is Job 27, verse 2 through 6. He says, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who's made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you're right, talking to his friends. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. In other words, he says, listen, I've lost everything, but I'm not going to let you take away my righteousness too. Like I'm not going to let go of that. In fact, later in Job 31, it's kind of the final chapter of this section before another guy comes on the scene named Elihu. We'll see him next week. Job in Job 31, he's just trying to think of every possible way to maintain his integrity. And so he says, I've been honest. I've never lied. I've maintained sexual integrity. I've cared for servants well. I've been generous with the poor as much as I can. I haven't put hope in my wealth because I know we're not supposed to do that. I haven't even rejoiced in my enemies' suffering. And he goes on and on. He's saying, I'm racking my brain here, trying to figure out how I could be punished for something because I don't see it. I'm innocent here. Now, if you feel like you've been falsely accused, if you feel like you are suffering some kind of injustice, you're not going to plead guilty, right? You're going to plead not guilty. Because I want my court to be heard, or my case to be heard in court. I want that opportunity to prove my innocence. And that's exactly what Job does. And so he uses a lot of legal language. He's like, man, if only we could go to court and settle this. And in fact, Job 31, this is, again, towards the end of his last speech. He says, verse 35, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. In other words, man, I wish I could go to court and hear what the prosecution could bring against me. I wish, because I have no idea why I'm walking through this. If this is true, I don't know why I'm suffering. Job chapter 9 is a large chunk of this legal language saying, man, I wish I could take God to court in essence. Verse 15, for example, says, though I'm in the right, I can't answer him. I must appeal for mercy to my accuser. If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. You hear that pain there. Later in verse 33 through 35, he says, there's no arbiter between us who may lay his hand on us both. Let him take his rod away from me, and let not dread of him terrify me. Then I would speak without fear of him, for I'm not so in myself. In the next chapter, chapter 10, for example, verse 2, he says, I'll say to God. So if I were in court and I could stand before him, this is what I'm going to say. Don't condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the designs of the wicked? Have you eyes of flesh? Do you see as man sees? Are your days the days of man, or your years as man's years? That you seek out my iniquity and search for my sin, although you know that I'm not guilty, and there's none to deliver out of your hand. So here's Job just over and over and over again in this discourse with his friends, and then switching to prayers in the middle of it, just saying, listen, I don't deserve this. I'm an innocent man. And so the second main argument from Job is, okay, since I'm innocent and I don't deserve it, God then must be unjust or cruel. Again, I don't deserve it. And because I hold this theology, God then must be unjust. So for example, Job 21, he's answering his friends they're maintaining God's perfect justice. They're saying, listen, Job, God doesn't screw up here. He's perfectly just. Job 21, verses 7 through 9, then he says, why do the wicked live? He's rebutting their argument. Why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their offspring are established in their presence, their descendants before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear. No rod of God is upon them. In other words, he's saying, like if God was really just, then why do the wicked prosper? Job 24, he charges God with more injustice by saying, verse 1, why are not times of judgment kept by the Almighty? Why do those who know him never see his days? Verse 12, from out of the city the dying groan, and the soul of the wounded cries for help. Yet God charges no one with wrong. In other words, he's like, it's like God looks at what's going on, and he withholds judgment on the wicked, while at the same time withholding help for the righteous. God's unjust here. Chapter 29, he identifies the removal of his earthly blessings as proof of God's rejection of him. This is Job 29, 2-4. He says, oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in my prime when the friendship of God was upon my tent. So again, this major response of Job is that, listen, I'm innocent, and because I'm innocent, God surely is unjust. Surely he's cruel. The scales of his justice are out of balance. They're out of whack. The third main argument Job is pleading for in these chapters is that God is also then indifferent, or he's absent. Right? So Job 23, for example, 2 and 3, he says, today also my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy on account of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. Verse 8, behold, I go forward, but he's not there, and backward, but I don't perceive him. On the left hand, when he's working, I do not behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see him. In other words, he's like, man, I'd love to hear from God. I'd love to talk to him about what's going on, but it seems like he's nowhere to be found. In fact, it feels like he's walked away from me. And if he's walked away from me, it's clear that he doesn't care about my situation. He doesn't care about my suffering. Job 30, verse 19, he says, God's cast me into the mire, and I've become like dust and ashes. I cry to you for help, and you don't answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. You've turned cruel to me with the might of your hand. You persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you'll bring me to death into the house appointed for all living. So, all in all, over and over again in these chapters, here's Job's replies to his friends, and his reply to God is, listen, I'm innocent. I don't deserve this, so God must be unjust. In fact, he's indifferent to my situation, which actually just further proves he's unjust. It just proves that he's cruel. So again, Job's friends and Job, and this is important, they believe the same theology. They believe the same retribution principle, but it leads them to polar opposite conclusions. Again, the friends, they remain stringent in their belief. Again, they are holding fast to this truth. All sinners suffer, and the righteous prosper. Job, on the other hand, believes that, that should be true, and I once thought that was true, but he also sees the innocent suffering. He's walking through it himself. He's seeing the wicked prosper, and so he's tempted to believe, no, actually, God is actually unjust and cruel and absent. And so here's the big difference. This is really important. For Job's friends, Job is the problem. For Job, God is the problem. And that's a big difference in the story. Now, what we see in Job here is this experience of a man whose faith is in crisis. Like there's a real tension here as he cries out in his pain. But notice, it's not that his experience causes him to walk away from faith in God. Rather, what it's doing is it's causing him to question what he believes about God. Right? And this is common for us, I think, when we walk through seasons of suffering. We often walk this same path. We might think, I thought I understood who God was. I thought I understood how he related to the world. I thought I understood how he related to me. But now because of this thing that's happened or the situation that I'm walking through, honestly, I have my doubts. Like maybe he isn't who I thought he was. Maybe he isn't really loving. Maybe he isn't really all-powerful. Maybe he isn't all-knowing. Because if he were any of those things, then surely the pain that I'm walking through is something that he would have prevented. So I thought I knew who God was, but now I'm not sure. I'm questioning it. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book titled A Grief Observed, and many of you may have read it. If not, it's just this incredibly honest book, very personal book where Lewis is really just writing out his own reflection on the grief that he was experiencing after the loss of his wife to cancer. And again, it's really honest because you hear this man, Lewis, like Job, just kind of wrestling with his faith in the midst of his incredible pain. And in fact, in one point in the book, he writes about this exact experience that Job is having without mentioning Job. And this is what he writes. He says, "Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but so this is what God's really like. Deceive yourself no longer." Again, what he's saying is, just like Job, it's not that Lewis is threatened to become an atheist. He's like, I don't think I'm going to become that. It wasn't that he's going to be tempted to deny God's existence. It's just that he might be tempted to deny God's goodness. And you might be tempted to do the same. Like you believed in a God who is a loving father. You believed in a God who is a good shepherd. A God who says he loves you and is in control of all things. But you experience, or you're experiencing right now, some painful season, and all of a sudden, you're just like, man, I'm just not so sure anymore. Like I'm praying, nothing seems to be getting better. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. And so like even now, I'm just wondering, does he even hear my prayers? Does he even care about my situation? Like it's in moments like those when our grief is affecting our faith. Like whether or not that faith is biblical. Like we wouldn't say Job's faith was perfect. No, our faith isn't perfect either. Like what you believe or what you thought was true about God, what you thought was true about his relationship to you, isn't playing out like you thought it would, and it shakes you. C.S. Lewis, again, in that book, he even describes that feeling of God's abandonment to him, much like Job does. He wants to know, where's God at? Why isn't he answering? Why doesn't he feel near to me? In fact, this is how he puts it. He writes, "Where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms of grief. When you're happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you're tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is in vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that silence, you may well turn away, because the longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become." Again, just this honest experience of grief. And so what Job and Lewis walk through is not uncommon to us all, right? I mean, our faith affects our grief, but sometimes our grief affects our faith. And so we need to be careful then, which is given the priority? Like, which is going to take the lead? And so when our grief and our faith seem to be at odds, what can we do? Is there anything we can learn from Job's replies and his prayers? There's a lot, I'm sure. I'm just going to focus on two this morning. What can we do when grief influences and threatens our faith? Number one, just be honest with the Lord. Just be honest with the Lord. Like if you find yourself in that space where you're like, God, I thought you were this, but right now it doesn't feel like it. Just be honest with him. You can actually take that to him. Because remember, he knows your heart already. He already knows what you're thinking. He knows all of it. Like there's no need to be hypocritical, pretending like things are okay when they're not. There's no need to add hypocrisy to your discontentment and frustration and anger. You can take it to the Lord. In fact, Job does this over and over again, chapter after chapter, putting his pain into words. And by the way, this is what so many of the psalmists do throughout the Psalms. I'll just give you a couple examples. Psalm 102, 1 and 2. It says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Don't hide your face from me in the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me. Answer me speedily in the day when I call." Or Psalm 142, verses 1 and 2. He says, "With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice, I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Again, in those times when you feel like the grief and the pain that you're carrying causes you to doubt God's goodness or to doubt God's care or God's sovereignty, you can actually go to him with that. I do think there's a caution here, though. Like, we should be careful because telling God what we think at times isn't what we truly think. It's just what we think will feel good to say. It'll feel good because we think might offend him. Like, for example, in our anger and our pain, we just want to inflict pain on someone else, especially the person we think is the cause of our pain, right? Hurt people hurt people. It feels good to bite back. It feels good to make that harmful comment. But C.S. Lewis, he likens us to kind of like an animal who growls and bites at the veterinarian who's caring for it. Honesty is the goal in our prayers, not combat. And there is a difference there. So be honest with the Lord. But secondly, at the same time, pursue humility. Pursue humility. Again, there's this great tension in the words of Job because on the one hand, he's angry. He's frustrated. He's hurting. He's in pain. And on the other hand, in so many other places, as he's processing that frustration, as he's processing that pain, he can't help but recognize the majesty and incomprehensibility of God. In fact, there's actually little glimpses of humility on the part of Job, even in the midst of him pouring out his pain into words. So, for example, Job 26 is an incredible chapter. In the context of this, Job 25, Bildad, one of the two friends, has just come to Job, tried to give him some more advice about his situation. And basically what Bildad is saying is like, Job, who are you to answer God? God is way too majestic for you to speak to him that way and that honestly. And it's so short, it's almost like Job interrupts him and it kind of stops him there. In Job 26, verse 1, he says, "Then Job answered and said, how you have helped him who has no power. How you have saved the arm that has no strength. How you've counseled him who has no wisdom, and plentifully declared sound knowledge. With whose help have you uttered words, and whose breath has come out from you?" In other words, read sarcasm in those words. He's being sarcastic. It's like he's saying, Bildad, wow, man, it's a good thing God has you to help him. In fact, it's quite an honor for me to speak to someone just so wise as you, to speak to someone who has God completely figured out, that you can dissect every single situation. Man, this is incredible. But then he goes on to say, Bildad, you don't really know what you're talking about. In fact, verse 5, he goes on to say, the dead tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Sheol is naked before God, and Abaddon has no covering. God stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not split open under them. He covers the face of the full moon and spreads over it his cloud. He's inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. By his power, he stilled the sea. By his understanding, he shattered Rahab. And by the way, that's not the Old Testament character Rahab, the woman from Jericho. Rahab is also a description of a sea creature in other places. By his understanding, he shattered Rahab. By his wind, the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Then verse 14, behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways. How small a whisper do we hear of him? But the thunder of his power, who can understand? It's like he's saying, Bildad, you think you have God figured out completely. But in reality, you have no idea. And if I'm being honest, neither do I. He's saying none of us completely understand him. None of us can grasp his magnitude. None of us can grasp his power and his wisdom and his holiness. None of us can fully grasp everything that God is doing around the world at any moment. And so Job is identifying really two important truths about God, his transcendence and his immanence, something we've talked about before, his transcendence, that God is far above his creation. He's unlike us. He's far above you and me, so far that we can't understand him. We can't know him unless he were to reveal himself to us. And here in Job 26, and speaking of the ways that God has worked in these incredibly powerful ways, Job says, listen, God has revealed himself to us, but everything that we see and everything that we know is merely a whisper. Like his power is incomprehensible. It's like thunder. But again, in comparison to everything that we know that God is and all that he does, I mean, we only heard a whisper of who he is. And so here's Job and all of this pain and all of this grief, and he does believe God is majestic and transcendent, incomprehensible, and all powerful, but it's like he's not applying it to his own situation. Like, it's always easier to give advice to other people. It's a lot harder for us to walk by our own advice. Like in that moment, he should have reminded himself, and all of his accusations of God's injustice and indifference, that maybe, just maybe, he doesn't have the full picture. Like maybe God isn't being unjust. Maybe God is actually good. Maybe God really is in control. Maybe God really is wise. Again, Job does believe that what we know and grasp of God only scratches the surface of his transcendent nature and work. He's whispered, but he's thunderous in power. That his is a power that created all things, a power that sustains all things. Us on this side of the cross, we know it's a power that's raised Jesus from the dead, that it's a power that really can work all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so Job's statement of God's majesty, by the way, which is a foreshadowing of his conversation with God, we're going to see here in a few weeks at the end of the book. Job's call for Bildad to demonstrate a little bit of humility when they speak on behalf of God was a call he should have heeded himself. And it's a call we should all heed. When in the pain of life and in the moments of our grief, our faith in God's goodness, our faith in God's sovereignty is threatened. Again, the choice we face in those moments really comes down to this. Will God's incomprehensibility, will God's majesty confound you, or will it comfort you? Like, will it produce frustration in you, or will it produce faith in you? Recognize when you're wrestling with the work of God in your life, you're wrestling with just a whisper of who he is and what he's done. And to be honest, when we come with this critical complaint about God and his work, we express really an incredible amount of arrogance. Because who are we to doubt God's good work in our lives? We can be honest about it, but we should be honest about that too. In fact, you might have seen this online, but just a few weeks ago, a video went viral on social media, and like most videos on social media, it's from someone's phone they were filming, and it was this person sitting on a plane. They were in their seats, waiting for their flight to take off. They hadn't taken off yet. They were still at the gate, and they're filming out the window, and what they were filming was a maintenance worker applying what looked to be like duct tape on the wing of their plane. Now, I've never really been afraid of flying. That's not a fear I've had. But I mean, that's not a sight I would love to see before we take off. Again, this video went viral. Thousands and thousands of people saw this video, and it caused them to think the absolute worst of the airline. I mean, like, who does that? Like, what kind of airline puts duct tape on their wing? It doesn't seem professional. It doesn't seem safe. I mean, that's how I fix things, but I'm not a mechanic. Again, this video went viral, and more people were seeing it, saying, man, this airline is terrible. This is why I never fly on this airline. I'll never fly on the airline ever again. Well, eventually, the airline had to say something. They had to speak up, and they did, and it turned out that what they were using wasn't duct tape at all. It looks similar. They agreed. It does look similar, but it was actually a special tape made of aluminum, and it's used often for very minor temporary repairs, and is actually approved by the FAA, thankfully. And so they had to say, listen, I know you thought this about us, but here's the truth. You didn't fully understand. Like, how often Do we think the absolute worst and speak the worst of people in situations that we don't fully understand? I mean, isn't that wrong? How much worse is it when we're critical of God and his work? It's been said that God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, but you might be aware of 3 of them. In fact, if we were to use Job's imagery, we could say, God is thunderous in your life, even though you only hear a whisper. However, even though we only have a whisper from God, he whispers good news. He whispers good news. We have the incredible privilege, again, to live on this side of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who is the incarnate Word of God, who speaks a good word by his life and his words. And while we might want to know all of the purposes of every situation we walk through, especially of those most difficult ones, of what it is God's doing, for now, sometimes, we just have to trust in his work in the gospel to reassure our hearts of his goodness. In fact, this is what Paul does over and over and over again in the New Testament. Romans 8's a wonderful example. Verse 31, he says, "What then shall we say to these things? If God's for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" In other words, he's saying if you're tempted at any time to doubt God's goodness, just look to the cross. Earlier in verse 18, he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that's to be revealed to us." I mean, that verse alone can provide endless opportunities for reflection and rest and hope, even though you don't have all the answers to what you're walking through right now. So I don't want to minimize pain. I don't want to minimize grief. I don't want to minimize suffering. They're real. But when your grief has outsized influence over your faith, be honest with the Lord. Pursue humility. Return to the cross. Let your heart be reassured of God's goodness and love for you. Like, instead of wrestling with the whisper, you can actually rest in the whisper, because the gospel actually shouts. The gospel shouts the glory of the one who brings life from death, beauty from ashes, and comfort to the hurting. But so often we don't. We're just like Job. We often doubt his justice and goodness and power. And again, especially when we're walking through those difficult seasons of pain and suffering. So it's good and right to be honest about it. Take it to the Lord, confess it, approach him with humility, just asking that he'd renew your faith in him.